Hi, I'm Jonathan Wellburn. Sad that I can't be there to meet all of you in person, but excited to talk about some of the work that I've been doing along with my colleague Aaron Strong at RAND on systemic risk nonetheless. So in today's talk, I'll go over some of the work we've been doing on this topic of systemic cyber risk, what it means for cyber, for policy, for insurance, but also some of the implications that we've come across for systemic risk at large. And we really got started on this just due to a series of costly cyber incidents. And we can all remember a bunch, right? So there's the Target data breach, which led to $160 million in damages and really brought at least our attention in the United States to how costly cyber could be. But it wasn't the only one. There was Saudi Aramco, which led to the destruction of 30,000 workstations. There was Equifax more recently, which led to the loss of sensitive information for 145 million people, or really most households in the United States. But there's just been many others. There was Anthem, PlayStation, Sony, OPM, Facebook, and Yahoo attacks, all different types of cyber attacks and cyber breaches, which have led to higher and higher costs over time. And while we were motivated by the question of how expensive cyber attacks could really be, the topic of systemic risk really is larger. So we're going to define what systemic cyber risk is and how we're using the term, then present a model of risk propagation, and then talk about some of the implications for cyber insurance and policy. But it's also useful to start by classifying cyber risk, and generally the terms that we're using. So there's a broad universe of terms all falling into a cyber incident as a loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and information systems. And then within that, there are the cyber attacks, the degradation, disruption, or corruption of information and information systems. And then there's the data breaches, the loss of confidential data following a cyber incident. Now, as we're defining these, I tried to use them separately, and the previous examples provide some useful examples. Equifax falling in a data breach, Saudi Aramco falling in a cyber attack. However, they're not mutually exclusive necessarily in all cases. And then using that, we can define what systemic cyber risk is. Systemic cyber risk is bigger than some of the incidents we're talking about in the past on the past slide. There are incidents which could cause widespread disruptions that ripple across interdependent firm networks and computer networks to cause a larger aggregate event. And as we can see from some of the past attacks, systemic cyber risk is already upon us. Back in there was the Dyn cyber attack, which was a DDoS attack on a company which is not exactly a household name, but important nonetheless. And Dyn was important because they were a domain name service provider for a lot of companies which are household names. So when they were attacked by a DDoS attack, then their networks were brought down, as were the networks of their customers. So that includes Amazon, Twitter, Spotify, Netflix. There's PayPal, so some transactions. There was CNN, so some media services for the Swedish government, and Box. All of these different types of things were also brought down at the same time. So while the cyber attack on Dyn, which lasted for a few hours, was seemingly small because Dyn is a seemingly small company, the fact that it could ripple across through its networks and disrupt its companies, its customers, which then could have effects on their supply chain connections, shows how a small incident could really grow and become something quite large. And then there was WannaCry and NotPetya. Those were global malware attacks and had a high cost and hit a diverse amount of industries from healthcare to education. And then there were the power grid attacks. In 2016, there was an actual power grid attack where Russia shut down power in Ukraine, but then there's also just been the threats of given Russia's intrusion into the US power grid, of the widespread disruption that would happen from a cyber attack on critical infrastructure like the electrical grid. So there's different types of systemic risk. systemic cyber risk that we can define. And so the first one of these is the cascading failure. So that's the domino effects that ripple across firms connected in supply chains and computer networks. Dyn is the good example of that. And then there are the common cause failures. These are failures which might exploit a common software or hardware vulnerability across multiple firms. So WannaCry was the example where that attack exploited the same shared external blue vulnerability in Microsoft software across many different machines all at the same time. Now, then there is a separate type of cyber risk being systemic cyber risk being independent failures, which could be, this is more of a hypothetical, because it could be incidents that result from multiple independent disruptions at many organizations at the same time. And while we don't really have examples of this today, luckily, there could be cases in the future, such as from quantum computing, where there's widespread encryption breaking that could lead to this type of risk actually being realized. And now for our, where we first started doing this research was focused on the risk to insurers and looking at how this then rolls up into the portfolio risk for insurers. So of course there are the idiosyncratic firm risks, which is a series of different firms targeted by independent attacks, as we just said. But then there's the more systemic ones, which are the common cause failures and the cascading failures, which could drive large portfolio losses. And so our goal then is to understand in more detail how these risks could play out and how large they could be and actually be able to model them. So we focus, though, for now, on the risk propagation, so those cascading failures, as the place where we can do kind of have the largest impact with modeling today. So we'll move over to that next. And our general approach for modeling the cyber risk propagation has been an interdisciplinary one. We've been taking tools from risk analysis and computational economics and combining them to create a model which estimates potential systemic costs associated with cyber incidents. And looking at the potential implications, are these losses too large for insurance alone? Do they warrant a new policy solution? And are there systemically important cyber firms in cyberspace? I think in the process of answering that third question, we can just start talking about systemically important firms at large. So we start with modeling cascading cyber risks. Our goal is to model the potential for these cascading failures, not estimate the likelihood, not make any predictions, but just look at the potential cost that could mount. Then we are doing this by constructing a model of firm networks and testing the impact of negative shocks. And the result is that we can evaluate the aggregate impact of cyber attack-driven outages at specific firms and their broader implications. So before getting into how we do that, it's good to acknowledge the fact that our work is coming on top of a growing literature on the micro foundations of aggregate losses. So that work in economics has focused on understanding network connections at the level of sectors and perhaps even the level of firms. And it's notable to mention one paper which we base this off of, of which we build on, and that was this 2012 paper from Osmoglu, Carvalho, Aggregale, and Tabasile in Econometrica, which they talked about the aggregate fluctuations from sector level shocks. And they specified a production economy as in this model where there's this tuple where of a set of sectors and this weighted adjacency matrix W, such that these weights are given the flows coming from a given sector I to another given sector J, and where F is a distribution of sectoral shocks. And essentially, so they've set up this economy where each of the sectors are producing. They're producing given inputs from another sector, and their output is being used as inputs to the production in another sector. And at the core of this, W is it's a weighted attention matrix, but it's also a network. It's a network of sector level connections. And they then calculate the change in aggregate output given these shocks, which is then this change in Y given multiplied by these two vectors, the vector of shocks and this vector V, where V is defined as follows, where we have this in red is often called the inverse Leontief matrix with some other added weights given the production function, Cobb-Douglas production function weights on labor is alpha, and so this allows for a relatively straightforward use of input and output analysis to estimate the effect of shocks in a given sector on the aggregate economy. It's also related to other cool things in network analysis like Bonesich centrality. So it's kind of talking a little bit about the centrality of individual sectors, which is a little bit less important on the sector point, but I think becomes more important as you look forward to firms. And this is built upon by many others, so in very useful ways. So there's the work from Carvalho, Newey, Sato, and Tabasile, which talked about which actually did firm level analysis building on this approach in Japan. Japan has unique access to data, and they were able to look at aggregate shocks that resulted from the Japanese earthquake. Arata used a similar approach to understand the effect of bankruptcies across firm level networks, but also using the Japanese data. And the Japanese data is somewhat unique in the fact that they have actual firm-to-firm connections, whereas we don't have that for the rest of the world. Now, Barreau and Savignac in their 2016 paper in QJE had defined actual firm-level networks and gave us this picture. And the very useful thing of this is it's actually a network between firms. It is derived from the Statement of Financial Accounting Standards 131, which requires that public companies report all key customers and suppliers. And that ends up being very useful for understanding what firm level networks somewhat look like. And you can build that out and get a relatively representative picture. Following Barreau and Savignac, Wu and Burge had used this similar data, and then we came to our studies. So in 2019, we had released our first paper on systemic cyber risk, which we'll then go and talk about in more detail now. And that is really building on these approaches. And then we also have more recently, and I'll touch on this a little bit at the end, our work on systemic risk in the broad economy, where we're able to go even further and make implications that go beyond this topic of cyber. But our first understanding when we looked at these different studies was that there's a need for a new approach, because while the sector level analysis is great and is the standard approach that many in economics use to understand how shocks might aggregate. And however, if outside of Japan, where the firm level data exists, it's very hard to do this type of analysis. So systemic risk occurs not between sectors, but across sectors and between firms. And so understanding systemic cyber risks really it requires this firm level data, but these structural firm level models did not exist in full due to data challenges. So we then explored two approaches for data-driven analysis at the firm level to understand the potential impact that cyber attacks could have on the aggregate economy. So we can explain this first approach, which was kind of in that Osmogler math of standard sector level analysis, building this network of connections between sectors, right? So in this picture, there's a network of connections between the tech sector and the communication sector. And essentially that whole approach with that matrix W that they're saying is here are the flows that go from the tech sector to the communication sector and used as inputs to their production. But in reality, different firms. And we really want to understand, well, if there's a cyber attack on one firm, what's the total effect? So we need to get down to this firm level. So this is our first approach. Now, our first approach is all about estimating the aggregate losses of firms through this common input-output. We can use some basic assumptions to produce a quantitative model of combining the sector analysis with data from public firms to do this representative firm model approach. And to explain what that means, so Apple's 13% of the tech sector by revenue. So what we are basically saying is that if we take the input-output linkage going from tech to communications, and we scale that down to 13% of that, that is what we're assuming is the flows going from Apple to communications. And then we can do the same thing. Cisco, they're 2% of the tech sector, so we scale it down to 2% on that linkage. Intel, we scale theirs down to 3.5%. And this is the approach that allows us to take representative firms and estimate their impact up to the communication sectors. And in fact, this approach these numbers are actually called Gaussian multipliers and has been used in other places. So that allows us to do this analysis of representative firms and to really aggregate up the impact of shocks on individual companies. Of course, Apple is a large company with many different suppliers, and that's where our second approach comes in. So our second approach was all about exploiting financial accounting standard number 131 so that we can partially construct a supply chain. So one note on this is this accounting standard requires public companies to report key customers or suppliers in their 10K filings. It only applies to public companies but provides insight on private company networks, because these linkages, as Barreau and Savignac pointed out in their paper, represent 75% of economic activity. That is, public companies are required to report private companies sometimes, and when you add all that up, it represents a representative share of all economic activity. And we mapped these data from connections and found the following network graphic, where this as before, where now instead of sectors, we have these clusters of firms which are grouped by their relationships, and the firms are here color-coded by firms that tend to work with each other. So it's a different way of looking at the economy through the lens of network analysis mostly. We can look at it and say, well, we have these notional connections which we can replace with real linkages. So instead of having this graphic, we can look and say, well, Apple's sitting right here close to the center of this network. So we can go into a little bit more detail about the first approach, this representative firms. And let's consider cyber attacks on a likely targets where a cyber attack causes a one-day outage. So these firms could be, for example, Visa, AT&T, Cisco, Chase, and Ford. We're all different possible targets that we selected just due to their diversity and industry type. So here's what those firms look like, right? So Visa is the smallest by revenue, and with about $18 billion in revenue. Then we go, Cisco's larger, and JP Morgan Chase is very large, and AT&T and Ford are quite large in revenue, but also similar in size. And they're different sectors. So Visa's retail trade, Cisco systems information, we have financial insurance, and AT&T, while similar in size, are different in their industry structure, right? So for all of these, we say this cyber attack lasts for a duration of one day, and then we have these resilience multipliers, which in our paper we give the reference, but it's an Adam Rose paper from 2007, which talks about their ability to absorb, which calibrates a model actually, at the sector level, and firms' ability to absorb this type of shock. So when we look at this, then we can do the analysis using this representative firm approach to say what would the direct impact be to these individual companies if they were hit with a cyber attack that lasted for a full day. And for point of clarification, we are assuming that this cyber attack wipes out all of their business for that full day. So if you swipe a Visa card, we're assuming it just doesn't work. And in that way, this is somewhat of an upper bound, a little bit corrected by the resilience multipliers, but still probably an upper bound on the potential cost that it could be. So Visa is quite low, given that it's the smallest, and all of these are really just in proportion to the size of their revenue, because that's all that's happening. They're losing this actual loss of 1 day in revenue. Now, if we go and multiply this through the network and look at all upstream, then we see a pretty different picture. Instead of $33 million, Visa's total impact is $100 million. Instead of, similar for Cisco, they are now up to $300 million. And JP Morgan Chase is around, I guess it's 200 million, doing math in my head. AT&T and Ford are considerably larger, now up to $1 billion. Now, one thing I should say about this analysis is JP Morgan Chase is a bit of an anomaly, which kind of keeps our analysis honest, which is why we've kept it in the paper, because this is kind of like saying their retail side only was affected and nothing else, and forgetting all of the other systemic effects that could happen if they were hit by a cyber attack that lasted for a full day. And in that sense, I think this would be underestimating the actual scale of an attack on JP Morgan Chase, because it's kind of leaving a lot of its business separated. So it's keeping the analysis honest. But then we can see what happens when there's upstream. So this is upstream, and we can see what happens when there's downstream losses. Sorry. And this is the part that was really the advancement over some of our previous work, and really trying to understand the systemic effects. And the numbers completely change. Visa is now going from, instead of 100 million, they're going to 13 billion. Then Cisco and all the other companies are greatly scaled up as well. AT&T and Ford are also extremely large, but there's also some key importances here too, which is the fact that their ordering has completely changed. Visa was the smallest and now is the second largest. AT&T and Ford were similar sizes, and now AT&T is dramatically larger in impact than Ford. And this has to do with their actual structure. So AT&T has extraordinary amounts of downstream impacts, given their importance at the point of sale. And AT&T and Ford are also quite different, given the nature of their business, where Ford is selling direct to is selling finished goods, and AT&T is used as an input for their production, leading to these significant differences in their aggregate impact. But then how can we validate these results? That's a little bit tricky, and the honest answer is we can't fully, but we can try. And so we looked at this Maersk example. So Maersk, as I briefly mentioned earlier, was a part of this NotPetya attack in 2017. And in this NotPetya attack, they suffered some of the largest losses, and they were public about it. So we can look at what our analysis says for Maersk, which is estimating direct impacts here in this red graph, around in this range centered around $400 million, going down to I think 250 in the bottom. And that's right in line with what Maersk has reported. Maersk reported around 300, a little, maybe potentially over $300 million in direct impacts. So I think they're right in our target estimation, and we can then see how that would ripple through, being over $1 billion potentially in upstream losses, and in some, given Maersk is a global shipping giant, for those who are familiar, they're incredibly important to global commerce. And incredibly central, so their downstream effects are very high, being $30 billion potentially, as our right sitting there in our average. And that part is hard to validate because it wasn't it doesn't fully show up in the data, but at least our estimations are saying part of this looks consistent, and the other part is worrisome given the scale. Now, here's our second approach. The second approach is to build on that and to say, well, we really would like to have true interfirm network analysis, because that is where systemic risk really lies. And now going towards firm level input-output analysis, I think warrants a little bit of math discussion for a minute, because now we have this set of firms. So we're essentially taking the Osmoglu 2012 approach and that style and adapting it with the minor addition, on face value, minor addition, that this economy specified by a tuple is instead of a set of sectors, is a set of firms. So that's the part in red. And then we can exploit all of the standard input-output analysis, same things that they were doing, and many others to understand the firm level, firm level shocks. So firm level output, yi, then leads to this aggregate output, where we have aggregate output y being this product of this matrix W, which is the weighted adjacency matrix of firms now. So that's also a much larger matrix, and using our inverse Leontief and so on, and we can calculate upstream, downstream, and aggregate losses the same way that we did leading into those previous charts on the past few slides. So all of that is very clean as we just substitute in for previous work and say that instead of sectors, it's firms. Now, the problem comes from reality. So the full network then is defined by this adjacency matrix, Aij, where the weighted adjacency matrix is related, but is only partially observed. And I can explain that a little bit, because we observe a partial network of direct connections, D, as we had written in the paper, where we say that this connection is just directional. Is a directional network, not weighted, because it's only 0 or 1 if we know that J is a customer of I, and it's 0 if we don't know that they're a customer of I. And recall, this is where the problem here comes from the Statement of Financial Accounting Standards 131, where we observe binary connections over if a customer makes up over 10% of a company's revenue. So we define this probability Pij of a directed edge from I to j, because we don't fully observe this. Just because we observe a 0 doesn't mean that the probability of a connection is 0. In fact, it's positive, because there might still be a connection between these firms. So that's our challenge, right? And so we went about this, I think, in a somewhat similar way to the past folks, but with a lot more data science. So we pulled business relationships first from all public companies, looking at it from CompuStat. That was our first idea. But then and that's actually, sorry, that's the Barreau and Savignon approach. We wrote an algorithm to search for through the SEC Edgar database to kind of just query it and extract all key documents, so that we could extract all of those 10K filings and report on what the firm-to-firm connections are. And we end up with a large network. It's a large network of firms, but we had to take it down a lot to find data where we actually had a subset of firms where we had complete financial data, so that we could, for the rest of the analysis, where we have to do some inference. So that there's a subset of this complete firms network where 6,000 firms and 20,000 edges, so 20,000 connections between these firms, where we have enough financial data to actually do some inference. And so this is the picture then. This is, we're kind of going from, the first step was similar as the Barreau-Savignon through the SEC Edgar data and other sources in order to estimate a network, which is somewhat more of a complete picture here. So there's notable challenges in firm level analysis, right? So I've mentioned this a couple of times, but it's a big problem. This accounting standard only requires reporting of of firms which are 10% of revenue, and so we observe the connection, but not how much, and this leads to this double selection bias, which Carvalho and Volatility pointed out in the paper last year, and I think it's been the great hindrance to actually doing firm level analysis in the United States. However, by using a model that determines what the true network connection should be, we're able to take a key step forward in doing firm level analysis, which actually enables us to do some of the things that we need to do to estimate truly what the effect would be of a cyber attack on a given firm. However, it's not just cyber, so that was our initial focus. We've basically been saying, how can we estimate how much a cyber attack costs? How can we estimate how much the systemic cyber costs would be associated with an individual incident? And stumbled upon something which allowed us to say a bit more about systemic risk in the broad economy, which is what we did in a paper published a few months ago. And I'm not going to go into the gory details of how we did this, but just to give an overview. And well, all that's in that paper, and I'd be happy to talk with each of you if you wanted to shoot me an email. We could find a time to discuss. But the whole idea of this is to take an observed network and to look at this observed network, and that is just the direct connections, which is a partial network, right? Do statistical inference on that network to guess essentially what the likelihood of each connection would be. Obviously, if it's an observed connection, the likelihood is 1. But for the other connections out there, we assign a probability on the possible connections between each network edge. Then we feed those probabilities, and you can take a draw from that probability. Now you have a single random draw from a overall random graph of firm-to-firm network connections, and we calibrate that. So we calibrate that by saying what are the essentially, can we set up a network that assigns as much output across each of the network edges and as little to sort of the residual in the economy. So we're saying firms have inputs and outputs, and we know that firm X has a series of outputs which it could then assign to the other firms that it's connected to, and we try to assign as much on those known edges as we can. The overall goal there is to have a network which reproduces the stylized facts of the economy. And then we spit out an estimated network. And we can use that estimated network, which estimates the existence and the strength of connections between firms in order to do interfirm network analysis. So just to say kind of what the inference looks like, we start off with around 6,000 firms, 20,000 known connections. We draw the probabilities, and that leads to just under 100,000 probable connections. Those are the likely connections being, I think we drew this just to draw this picture, probability is above a half, just for the probable ones. That's out of a huge universe of 34 million possible connections. And just perhaps one note about this is that the huge universe of 34 million possible connections can make some of the computations a little bit tasking, and I think that's one thing we talked about a bit in the report. So each of the details once you do this are a little bit harder than one might expect. But it allows us for much deeper analysis. So we studied the systemic risk posed by the largest 1,000 firms in this 2020 paper. And the results really underscore the importance of new sources of systemic risk. We were focused on cyber originally, but then we started thinking of natural disasters. That was another one. And obviously the current events of today, which are preventing us from meeting in person, is the sort of ultimate form of systemic risk. So let's go back to consider a similar example as previous, this time causing a 1% loss in revenue. We can go and rank firms according to their systemic risk with several asterisks, right? So we can name names, but knowing that this is not a true prediction, we're not calling anybody out and saying this company is at the highest risk category. I think there's additional risk that should be done, sorry, additional work that should be done in this effort before it's used in some type of formal stress testing avenue. But I think it definitely could be eventually. So this is what when you look at a 1% shock resulting from a cyber attack in this scenario, but it can result from other things. And this is what it would look like. And so when we ranked all of our companies in this top 1,000, this was the top firms according to their total economy-wide losses. And surprise, surprise, Amazon is on top. Amazon has the largest systemic impact of any given company. So in this case, where there was some outage that led to a 1% shock on Amazon, then that would result in $1.5 billion in losses to Amazon and $77 billion to the overall economy, and in an aggregate economic multiplier of 54 times. And there's a lot of things to say about this chart and this table of results. The first is that there is a diverse number of firms on here. Amazon, Walmart, Apple, AT&T, Bank of America, Exxon, Allstate, IBM, Anthem, GoDaddy, you'll get to that in a minute. These are all from diverse sectors. They're from insurance, they're from business services, they're the communications, they're tech firms, they're general retail, some manufacturing. It's not on this list, but close down beneath it. So I think that you see a variety of firms which don't fit the traditional narrative. So it isn't just about a cyber attack or another type of large-scale loss on the finance sector, for example. We can see that some of these attacks causing large losses across broad sectors of the economy would have large aggregate effects. Amazon is a really interesting example because if we look at the 2008 level view of the world of viewing systemic risk in that guise, it's we're very focused on the finance sector, but Amazon's completely changed the nature of their business since in the decade since, and I think one of their core businesses now, Amazon Web Services, was barely in operation at that time a decade ago, but now has grown to be servicing a large amount of the economy, a large amount of government services, probably critical infrastructure as well, and has a large amount of systemic cyber risk underlying it. And so it is interesting that it rose to the top of this list, but not entirely surprising when you think of the critical centrality of Amazon at the current point in time. Now, I said I would come back to Daddy on the bottom. It's not one of the top firms that we have. It was the top firm when we ranked its aggregate multiplier effect. Now, because the losses on GoDaddy are actually kind of small. It's a small company. However, its aggregate multiplier effect, where Amazon's was 54, Allstate's was 68, and those were all large, it's 1,800, showing that the connections underlying GoDaddy's core business have a large and outsized impact following this shock. So the key advancement here is that we're able to look at what the systemic impact would be of these cyber attacks, and seeing that, well, indeed, there's a lot of companies which are potential cyber threat targets that have high levels of systemic risk, which is particularly concerning. So what about common cause cyber risk? I dropped this one and thought I would come back to it quickly before wrapping up. But for common cause cyber risks, we didn't model any type of detail, frankly, just because it's hard. We can further a conceptual model, which we did in our paper, just to discuss it because it's very interesting. And it relates to this common software hardware vulnerability, for example, like Eternal Blue. And if we want to think about it, we can consider an analogy to the natural disasters. So in the natural world, physical proximity drives common cause risks. For example, homes co-located near a floodplain have the same amount of common cause risk. And one could think about the same type of thing in cyberspace, that in fact there might be a cyber floodplain which creates a similar type of correlated risk, where even though companies are dispersed in they don't look to be dependent. They're in different parts of the world. They do different types of businesses. One does manufacturing in Indonesia. One does shipping in the North Sea. They don't seem to be related. However, they might live in the same cyber floodplain by having the same hardware and software. And that is a type of correlated risk that is very important for the cyber domain. Figuring out how to estimate it. And I think we can come up with an idea, which is to potentially measuring the number of shared software and hardware assets between companies. And that might be able to shed some light on this. However, that data doesn't publicly exist, to my knowledge. If you know of it, well, let's talk. Instead, I think it might require data on firms' IT assets and where they intersect, which would be, it's certainly a data challenge. So I'll leave you here with some implications, which is that the 2008 crisis revealed systemic risk in the financial sector, where banks were too big and too interconnected to fail. Right? That's a common understanding. However, the economy has undergone significant changes since then, and if we look at changes to Amazon, Alphabet, Apple, just alone, we can see how there is a different landscape in risk today. Our work highlights reasons to broaden the focus to diverse sectors and to new hazards. And when we look at cyber, we see that aggregate costs can far exceed the cost of individual firms, and the risk to insurers might come from multiple policies being triggered at once. So Visa, for example, is cutting off its point of sale services for one day. The losses to Visa are not that bad. This is something that obviously insurance policies could cover. However, the aggregate losses to the entire economy, if they were to reach $19 billion, would trigger many other policies like liability, business interruption, that would far exceed the cost to cyber insurance. Notably, this is hazard specific. While our current systemic risk of the day being the coronavirus, that one is a much larger systemic risk than anything we're talking about, but it represents a lower portfolio risk for insurance due to the policy exemptions. So this in combination with our recent findings about the systemic risk in the broad economy and the importance of large tech sector firms underscore the risks of systemic cyber risks in general. This has a lot of implications for cyber policy because the reliance on cyber insurance alone might not be a wise policy. Efforts probably should be made in order to improve system resilience and strengthen cyber standards across companies at large. Now we have some current efforts. We want to continue understanding interfirm networks because I think that there is a lot of applications there, and the cyber is certainly one of them. And system resilience at large, as well as correlated cyber risks. With that, I will leave you with this screen, and which has our 2 papers that we've referenced in this talk and my email address. And I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to sit with me today, which has been 40 minutes. And so look forward to any questions you may have. Please send me an email. Thanks.